Let me set the stage. It's January 15th, 1919. World War I has just ended, Prohibition is about to begin, and Boston is in the middle of a winter heat wave as temperatures soar into the 40s. You spent the morning aboard Fireboat 31 patrolling the harbor, and you've just returned to your firehouse off Commercial Street, tucked in the shadow of a massive 2.3 million gallon molasses tank the Purity Distilling Company built a little over 4 years ago. You and the boys are in the middle of your lunchtime card game when you hear a loud rat-tat-tat, like somebody hosing the street with a machine gun. A loud rumble follows, causing you to rush to the window to see what's going on. You're greeted by the sight of that 2.3 million gallon molasses tank coming apart at the seams, sending a 25-foot tall wave of syrup and metal racing towards your station at close to 35 miles per hour, barely giving you time to shout one word before it crashes into your station. Run. Now, I'm pretty sure you're all wondering just what a 2.3 million gallon storage tank of molasses is doing smack dab in the middle of Boston's North End. Well, the answer's pretty simple. Alcohol. No, not that alcohol, the other kind. Don't get me wrong. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company and its Massachusetts subsidiary, the Purity Distillery Company, made a pretty penny on rum and spirits. The majority of their production, though, went to industrial alcohols used for solvents and cleaners, among other things. And in 1915, business was booming. See, another use for industrial alcohols was smokeless gunpowder and high explosives. As the First World War entered its bloody stalemate on the Western Front, everybody involved realized their ammunition stockpiles were as optimistic as the belief the war would be over by Christmas. Orders were flying in from Britain and France for munition factories in the Northeast, and in turn, orders from those factories were flying into Purity Distillery. Production was set to double in 1915 alone, and USIA needed a way to get molasses from the Caribbean to their distilleries in East Cambridge, Massachusetts, while cutting out as many middlemen as possible. Arthur P. Gell was eventually tasked with building a 2.3 million gallon storage tank on Boston's North End. The site was perfect, only a couple hundred feet off the water where the ships would dock, and nestled right next to an elevated railroad track for easy transport to the distillery. That's where the smart decisions end, though. Joe wasn't an architect, or a construction foreman, or even involved in the transportation and storage of molasses. He was the company treasurer. The man was a career bean counter without a lick of practical experience, concerned with one thing, and one thing only when it came to this project: how the company books looked at the end of the year. And he and the company had both bet on the tank being completed by New Year's Day 1916. Unfortunately, on top of everything else I've already said about Gell, it seems that he wasn't a good negotiator either. Despite opening talks with the Boston Elevated Railroad Company in January 1915 for the land, it took until late September to sign the lease. Additional delays in completing the concrete pad and shipping the steel up to Boston meant that the construction didn't start until the beginning of December. Joe knew that things would have to go almost perfect to get the job done by the time the first tankers arrived. And things went far from perfect, with 2 blizzards and the death of a construction worker bringing construction to a halt on 3 separate occasions. Still, work was completed on December 29, 1915, with 2 days to spare before the first shipments arrived. Well, almost at least. There still was one little thing left to do. Joe was supposed to fill the tank to its entire 2.3 million gallon capacity with water to test for leaks before putting it into service. This was standard practice at the time, as fittings were rarely perfect and inevitably needed to be tightened post-construction. The process would have taken the better part of a month, though, and cost the company a pretty penny to access Boston's water mains. Now, maybe, if he was still on the original timeline, the pain-pinching Gel might have done it. But with only 2 days left to spare, and both the company's economic future and the guaranteed vice president's position on the line, Joe decided to cut that corner. He filled the tank with maybe 100,000 gallons, just enough to bring the water level above the first row of rivets, and called it good enough. As I hope would surprise nobody watching this, it wasn't good enough. Pretty much from the first tanker offloading its cargo, the tank proved to be a bigger sieve than the Bruins' goaltending situation during their inaugural season. Rivers of brown syrup ran down it like a slow-motion waterfall, and neighborhood children soon began sneaking onto the property with buckets to collect the runoff for use at home. Both Foreman William White and now company vice president Arthur Gell received constant complaints about the leaks, with Isaac Gonzalez being the most vocal. Gonzalez's job required him to climb into the tank between molasses shipments to make sure the pipeline connections into and out of the tank hadn't been blocked by residue. During these inspections, he noticed a constant layer of metal flakes both on the floor of the tank and covering his hair and clothes as he came out. Collecting these metal fragments, he went so far as to go to Gell's office and dump them right on his desk, along with warning about the tank's condition. This led to two things happening in 1917. The tank's slate gray exterior was painted brown to better hide the stains from the molasses, and Gonzalez was told in no uncertain terms that he needed to shut the hell up or he'd be fired. Gonzalez would later resign in September 1918 and enlist in the Army, a move that would ultimately save his life. Because whether or not anybody realized it, Isaac had discovered the smoking gun that would cause the tragedy on January 15th. The loading and unloading of molasses, temperature changes due to Boston's climate, and the buildup of gases from fermented molasses all caused the tank's walls to expand and contract under pressure. This cycle led to a phenomenon known as metal fatigue. Microcracks soon began to form throughout the steel plates that made up the tank's shell, and as the cycle continued day after day, these cracks grew and joined together, especially near the poorly sized rivet holes. This was made worse by the fact that Gell had cheaped down the tank's materials, something that shouldn't really shock anyone. The resulting investigation after the accident found that not only was the steel plating low-quality pig iron, but that it was also half the thickness it needed to be for the job. Those steel flakes that Gonzalez was finding, that was the tank disintegrating from the inside out. USIA and Peoria Distillery were too busy at the moment to worry about that, though. Not only was the war ending, but growing support for Prohibition in the 18th Amendment meant that sometime in 1920, the United States was about to go dry. The company was looking at a huge economic shortfall, and to save it, Gell came up with a plan that involved making as much hard liquor as possible in the first half of 1919, and using the rest of the year to convert their distillery back to 100% industrial solvents and clear out their stockpiles, using all the panics buying that would be occurring in the fall and winter of 1919. On January 13th, 1919, the tanker Malero had finished filling the tank to its full 2.3 million gallon capacity, something that had only happened 8 times over its lifespan. Over the next 2 days, the temperatures in Boston would soar from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to over 40, and the poorly designed, poorly built storage tank finally gave up the ghost. It's still not known exactly where the tank began to fail at 12:41 p.m., but the most likely spot seems to be the openings for the inlet pipes that carry the molasses from the ships to the tank. The eyewitness reports would vary, with some describing a machine gun-like string of pops as rivets failed and flew from the tank in all directions, while others would report an ear-piercing screech of shearing metal. Some would later claim the tank seemed to explode, or that the steel sides came apart like someone had tugged at the zipper holding the whole thing together. With a loud crash, the roof of the tank pancaked into the concrete pad it had been built on, sending a 20-foot-high wave of molasses into the surrounding neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. Now I know you're thinking, molasses can't move that fast. There's a reason we use the phrase slow as molasses. The thing is, molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid, and one of its properties is that its viscosity decreases under pressure. As the tank lid slammed into the ground, it acted like a hydraulic press, causing the molasses to flow like water as it poured down Commercial Street and into the waterfront. In a matter of minutes, a roughly 1-mile stretch of the north end had been turned into a sugary war zone. The elevated railroad track that the tank had been built beside took a 1-ton piece of steel to its supports, causing the track to buckle seconds after a passenger train had crossed the stretch. The entire block of residential houses between Commercial and Charter Streets was reduced to matchsticks and rubble, to debris carried further down into the houses behind them. A 25-foot-tall wave scoured the streets of Boston of all foot, horse, and automobile traffic, and residents that had opened their windows and doors to enjoy the unseasonably warm temperatures found their houses flooded with the brown liquid. Out on the waterfront, that wave had crashed into the North End Paving Company, reducing it to matchsticks. Firehouse 31 was ripped clean off its foundation and nearly carried into the waters of Boston Harbor by a wave that tossed rail cars like toys. As bad as the destruction had been, though, it could have been much, much worse. Next to the paving company and firehouse was a playground. Had the collapse happened in the middle of summer rather than on a January school day, who knows how many kids would have been picked up by the tidal wave and drowned in the harbor. Firefighters and police officers from all over the North End arrived on the scene within minutes, thanks to another piece of good luck. Patrolman Frank McManus had been in a police call box, giving a report when he witnessed the tank disintegrate before him. As his panic calls said emergency responses in motion, doctors and nurses from the nearby Haymarket Relief Station rushed to the scene to provide aid to the injured, lucky enough to escape the worst of the tidal wave. What these first responders encountered was a scene out of a horror movie. Hundreds of humans and animals thrashed about in a soup of molasses and debris that was 2 to 3 feet high in some places. Victims desperately struggled, not realizing that their frantic movements were only dragging them deeper into the morass. Joined by sailors from the USS Nantucket, firefighters began working their way down Commercial Street towards where the storage tank had formerly stood. In spots where the molasses was too deep to walk through, they suspended ladders over the street to reach victims and pluck them out of the debris. Others began carefully cutting into houses to search for survivors. At around 2 p.m., rescue workers finally made it to Firehouse 31. The building had been lifted off its foundation by the wave and moved 10 feet, nearly putting it into Boston Harbor. The second floor had pancaked into the first floor, trapping firefighters Bill Connor, Nate Bowering, and George Leahy, along with civilian stonecutter John Barry, in a pocket that was only 18 inches high and slowly filling with molasses. Debris and pieces of the steel tank had built up along the smashed sides of the firehouse, forcing firefighters to bring cutting torches in to clear a path before they could even attempt to enter the structure and extricate those trapped inside. Once inside, they used handsaws and axes to carefully cut away the second floor to reach their trapped brothers. Their efforts came too late to save third engineer George Leahy. Buried under a pool table, Leahy had struggled to keep his head above the molasses pouring into the ruined firehouse for what those inside assumed was approximately 2 hours before exhaustion forced his head under for the last time. It took until 5 p.m. for firefighters to pull his body from the rubble, cutting away 3/4 of the second floor to do so. He was 37 years old, an 8-year veteran of the Boston Fire Department, and left behind a wife and 3 kids. Bill Connor and Nate Bowering had been trapped under a radiator, only surviving because they managed to kick a hole in the wall to drain the molasses, threatening to smother them. Both would continue to serve the Boston Fire Department until 1940 and 1956, respectively, though both their careers would be hampered by back injuries suffered in the collapse. The two men, along with scores of other wounded, flooded the Haymarket Relief Station. Most were covered head to toe in a thick layer of molasses that made it difficult to even identify them, let alone diagnose injuries. Attempts to clean the patients only created more problems as the black liquid soon began to coat every nook and cranny of the hospital. George Leahy would be one of 11 people pronounced dead on the 15th, with scores more simply labeled missing. The most tragic of these was 10-year-old Maria DeStasio, who had been collecting firewood at the base of the tank when it collapsed. Maria's body was found in the wreckage of the elevated railroad track that ran next to the tank. Her older brother Antonio, who had been there with her, was now fighting for his life at the relief station, his skull cracked open like an egg. As night fell, electrical lighting was brought in to allow firefighters to continue operations, even as everyone came to the grim conclusion that this had turned from a rescue to a recovery. The crew scraped together from off-duty members and crews from other houses to man Fireboat 31, which, unlike its crew, had survived the molasses wave unharmed aside from a new paint job. The morning of the 16th brought a new problem to rescue workers. The molasses had begun to solidify as temperatures took another sharp turn, and initial attempts to wash it away with fresh water proved useless. It wasn't until fireboats pumped millions of gallons of salt water into the streets that any progress was made. The death toll continued to rise throughout the week. On Friday, January 17th, 21-year-old Ralph Martin succumbed to his infected wounds. The same fate befell railroad worker James McMullen on the 19th. Like the children, McMullen had been at ground zero of the collapse when it happened, and had broke both his femurs. An hour later, city worker Patrick Bren died of pneumonia. He'd been carried into the harbor by the wave and had only survived the 15th because of a passing merchant crew. As Monday rolled around, rescue crews began pumping out cellars and moving the bigger pieces of wreckage, like automobiles and rail cars. It was under one of these that the body of Pasquale Ayatosca, another child that had been at the base of the tank when it had collapsed, was discovered. The tidal wave had so badly mauled the boy that his family could only identify him by his clothing. All throughout the winter and spring of 1919, bodies would be discovered hidden amongst the piers and harbor warehouses. The last one was found May 12, 1919. While all this was going on, the disaster was slowly spreading across Boston thanks to the men trying to clean it up. We're about 30 years too early for serious decontamination procedures brought about by the nuclear age. And as the cleanup continued into the spring and summer, firefighters and onlookers tracked molasses all over Boston. For decades, you'd be able to smell the sweet aroma, especially in the North End. 21 people would be killed by the flood, with another 150 injured, many with permanent disabilities. USIA would manage to dodge criminal charges, but it wouldn't be so lucky in the civil lawsuits brought about by the victims. In a fine dose of karma, the testimony that would ultimately sink the lawyers' attempts to paint the collapse as an anarchist plot and not their own criminal negligence would be provided by Arthur P. Gell himself. On the surface, the Great Molasses Flood feels like something out of an episode of a firehouse drama, a nonsensical situation that would require an equally nonsensical solution to solve. But when we get down to it, the rescues that day were really just water rescues and building collapses, things we've all trained for. The reality is that most incredible scenarios are, at their base, things we've all trained for with a little wrinkle thrown in. We all know how to shore up a building with cribbing, and most large-scale departments have a confined space team. We all have the basics down for EMS, rope rescue, water rescue, and decontamination, and all department pre-plans should include a specialist team if needed. And would you look at that? We've managed to solve 90% of the problems the Boston Fire Department faced that day. Take care, folks, and stay safe out there.